Sit downers, Steam Gornitis. Unleash this book reviews. Bring you book reviews from time to time when I feel like it. Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays. I sit down after I finish a book and I try to come up with coherent thoughts, things to tell you guys, a list of things that I want to touch on in my discussions, but it never works out. I can't collect my thoughts when I write it down, and I don't even think a lot of times I come up with coherent thoughts when I talk into the camera, but it's the only way I can do it. So what you're getting right now is going to be right off the top of my head. Here we go. It's like, okay, Kurt Vonnegut, Breakfast of Champions. Now I know I said in my last week's review that I was going at Blood Meridian this week, but Blood Meridian is very long, and not only is it long, but it's detailed and you have to read it slow, I have learned. And so I'm only about halfway through that book, maybe a little bit more, but in between I picked up Kurt Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, and Kurt Vonnegut is great, as I've said before, because he's one of the easiest authors of literary merit that you can pick up and put down just like that, because his chapters are divided into like 50 to 100 mini little sub-chapters, you know, and every one is like less than a page long. So you never have that feeling, oh, I gotta read through 5 more pages to get to the next chapter, and I really am bored with reading right now, and so you don't focus on the last 5 pages. You know, this, you just slip that bookmark in, whatever. I've said that before. Breakfast of Champions, though, released after Slaughterhouse-5, about halfway through Kurt Vonnegut's writing career, I would say, give or take. But when he released it, he told people it was going to be his last book. And I learned that because I read a paperback version, that's right, not on the internet, a paperback version of Cliff Notes of all Vonnegut's major works. But the thing was, it was released in the late 1970s, and so the last book that it talks about is Breakfast of Champions. And they explained that at that time Vonnegut thought he was done. And that's an interesting take, because when you read this book, you'll realize one of the main things he's going at here is the release of his characters that he's used as puppets his whole writing career. And this is a notion that Vonnegut talks about in lots of his books. Now, I haven't read all of his stuff. I've only read 4 of his books. I've read Slapstick, Slaughterhouse-5, Cat's Cradle, and now Breakfast of Champions. But one thing I've noticed in all the books is that Vonnegut really doesn't believe in free will too much. He is more of a whatever happens to you happens, and you can't really change who you are as a person. That's just the way it's set out to be. That's in Slaughterhouse-5 with Billy Pilgrim, who gets unstuck in time and goes from one aspect of his life to the next, bouncing all around, including being stuck in like an alien zoo in space. You know, stuff that he can't really do much about. It's just gonna happen to him because it's already in the time-space fabric. Yeah. So, in this book, Vonnegut brings out one of his most famous characters, which is Kilgore Trout. And Kilgore Trout is a very similar person to Vonnegut himself. I think Vonnegut threw a lot of his own characteristics into this fictional author. Of course, it's not completely Vonnegut, but there's a lot of similarities. One area that's not similar, at least as far as I know, is Kilgore Trout gets practically none of his books published in their own form, but instead published in porno books and magazines with completely different titles that have nothing to do with the story, and pornographic pictures that have nothing to do with his story placed in the middle of his stories. But that's the only way he can really get published, and so nobody really knows that he's an author that much, except once or twice when he runs into a fan, and this happens in Breakfast of Champions, and it totally throws him off guard because he's not used to having fans. But when he does, he doesn't even admit that he wrote the stuff. Weird, right? Anyways, the story revolves around Kilgore Trout and one of his hundreds or thousands of stories that he wrote in his time as an author. And it's a story, it's a science fiction story, because that's the type of writer Kilgore Trout is, about how a man is the only creature created by God that has free will. One man. That's the main character in this Kilgore Trout novel. And that man has free will, but every other man on Earth is really just a robot or a machine that was set up by the creator of the universe to be either a mean machine or a nice machine or a sarcastic machine or whatever type of machine they're supposed to be. They have all been created for this one person who has free will. Now, Kilgore Trout writes this book. He doesn't expect a whole lot of it, except when another man in this book, the second protagonist, Dwayne Hoover, I think was his last name, starts to go a little crazy, and Vonnegut uses a very easy, and he says that it's easy, excuse for going crazy, that he just has some bad chemicals in his brain. And this man who is very quickly going crazy picks up the Kilgore Trout novel and reads about this main character and then decides that that is how his life is too. So now Dwayne believes that he is the only person in the universe who has free will. And he's crazy. And he does some crazy things. Now that's the basic plot of the story, but with Breakfast of Champions, it's not really about plot. And that's what the 1999 adaptation of this book into film that starred Bruce Willis, that apparently like most people have kind of forgotten about, that's why it sucked. Because the director completely missed the point, at least in my opinion and in most people's opinions who's read this book. And that is that the book's not really about plot, and the movie focuses completely on plot. With this book is tied together by plot. Every book needs, a fictional book needs some sort of plot to, loosely make it work. But instead what this book is really about is Vonnegut clearing his head at the age of 50 when he wrote this book of past erroneous ways of looking at the world, trying to purge his life of bad things and start over again. So he gives us all his basic ideas that he's formulated in his life on everything American culture, mankind and their relationships with other men and women. I don't know, just all his different perceptions and why they're right or wrong. What it really turns out to be is kind of like black humor. It makes you laugh, but it makes you kind of sad at the same time, and it makes you see things a little differently, but mostly it makes you laugh. And if you've read Vonnegut before, you know what I mean when I'm talking about that stuff. It's just, in this aspect, it's cranked to the next notch. Based on his other works that I've read before, this is the least plot-driven book of his that I've read. And in response to that, it's probably my favorite of his that I've read. You get to really see Vonnegut, to the point that he breaks one of the most cardinal rules of fiction, in that he puts himself as the author into the book, working with these characters. He is there, sitting, watching his characters do things. So when Dwayne is going nuts and crazy in a lounge bar, Vonnegut is sitting right there watching him in his story. Yeah, it gets kind of, weird like that. But it's awesome, and it's great. At the end of the book, Vonnegut frees his characters and gives them all free will. Kilgore Trout is the only one that Vonnegut tells straight on that you will now have free will. And what does Kilgore Trout say as he's granted this beautiful freedom? Give me my youth. Now that's not a direct quote. I can't remember the exact words, but it's something very short like that. And basically what it's saying is that man is never happy with what he gets. He's given free will, and instead he wants to be young again. Yeah. So, that's me babbling about Breakfast of Champions. If you've never read Kurt Vonnegut, start with Slaughterhouse-Five, because that's his most famous and that's what everybody knows. And it's important to have that in your repertoire of books that you've read. But if you're looking for the next best thing, or in my opinion, Vonnegut's best of what I've read, Breakfast of Champions, hit it up. Going through Blood Meridian, I'm going to finish it eventually, and I'll give you my thoughts. Maybe I'll give you my thoughts halfway through. Alright? See ya. Then. Later. Peace. Howdy. Bye. See ya.